An Introduction to Nelson Makamo, Exploring Individual and Cultural Identity. In 1982, when Makamo was born, South Africa was a country deep within the midst of political turmoil. Nelson Mandela was still in prison, society was deeply segregated, and any resistance to apartheid regime was met with violent crackdowns. Although the international community was beginning to condemn what was happening, very little had changed for those living under the regime, and it wasn't until 1991 that apartheid legislation was repealed. Perhaps it's no surprise then that art during this period was dark and political in nature. During apartheid, black South Africans were banned from art schools and museums. A black South African would only be able to enter an art gallery if they were accompanied by a white person. Broadly speaking, art was divided into two categories, one that attempted to convey people's suffering and one that attempted to mobilize people into political action. A brief survey of art at the time shows artists favored realistic pictures of people's lives and somber colors and atmospheres. This artwork, entitled The Journey, created by David Koloane, a famous South African artist, depicts the final hours of black South African activist Stephen Biko. In Koloane's work, you can see a figure, Biko's figure, restrained. The rough texture of the drawing, the scratchy lines and layered entangled lines seem to represent both the pain of the figure in the painting as well as the pain felt by supporters of Biko at the time of his death. Which is why, perhaps, Nelson Makamo felt compelled to do something different. As he was growing up, the ANC, the African National Congress, were elected to government and a growing sense of optimism swept the country. Makamo embraces bold colours, big gestures, and expressive textures in order to channel some of the optimism he must felt around him. Perhaps this was Makamo's way of trying to move past the injustices of the preceding decade and encouraging his audience to see South Africa as more than a place of suffering and despair. Makamo grew up in a small town in South Africa's Limpopo province. Makamo's early artistic influences came from Picasso and Van Gogh. But as his understanding and knowledge of art and artists broadened with age, Makamo was inspired and uplifted by African artists. Makamo cites Demele Fene as being a major influence and inspiration to his artistic practice. Although their style and subject matter differ, Makamo found solace in knowing that someone like him, someone who grew up in apartheid South Africa, was able to produce work that represented their own experience and use their artwork to convey personal and reflective meaning. Makamo found influence and inspiration in representation. Now, let's take a in-depth look into one of Makamo's artworks. This portrait by Makamo is titled We Are Angels with Dirty Faces. True to Makamo's style, this artwork uses texture, colour and composition to capture the movement and charisma of youth. Makamo uses a combination of watercolour, printmaking, charcoal and ink to create a sense of movement. Even though the image is fixed, the child is not static and is not limited or confined to the canvas. Makamo's artworks are often influenced by South African children, a lot of the time loosely based on his cousin. These gestural pieces, with their dizzying use of line, playful use of texture and colour, and captivating gaze of the model, aim to capture the optimism and hopefulness of the children around him in South Africa. If we consider how Makamo is influenced by Fene, we can assume that Makamo uses his artwork to engage his community and culture, dialogue about optimism. By capturing these hopeful, confident faces, by presenting them to us on a large scale, Makamo is giving a positive and uplifting voice to a demographic who are often depicted as impoverished, hopeless, and lost. So, some key concepts to remember when discussing Makamo's work. Remember the context of the artist. Makamo grew up in apartheid South Africa. Consider what art looked like at this time. If you're growing up around visual imagery like this, you may have a skewed perspective of how you were seen by others or how you should see yourself. Representation made a huge impact on Makamo's trajectory as an artist. Being able to look at the work of an artist with whom he felt a certain affinity or similarity help spur him on to create work confidently. Makamo chooses to represent hope and optimism. His artwork is social commentary. He chooses to present the best part of those around him, not to create a false perception, but to address negative and disempowering stereotypes. Thank you for listening.